Good afternoon. My name's Stephen Berry, and this is the Stephen Inquisition. On the Stephen Inquisition, I'll interview anyone about anything they wish for a 1 hour period. Guests have the option of ruling out topics they will not discuss. So if you did a lot of coke when you were younger and you don't want to talk about it, that's fine too. But I will grill each guest to ensure that they know what they're talking about and get to the truth at the bottom of the discussion. There'll be no room for dodging questions or political tricks. I was a politician myself for several years and I've done them all before. If you want to appear as a guest on the Stephen Inquisition, email mrberrynz@gmail.com. Will you survive the Inquisition? Also, the Stephen Inquisition today is brought to you by Optus 4G Wireless Internet. They're not sponsoring the show, but this is how it's being broadcast. We'll see how that goes. Thank you to my supporters on patreon.com/MrBerry, Mr. Berry, Stephen Overton, Bruce Carley, Mike McCormick, and Mega Mike. You can also contribute to the show at PayPal at MrBerry or crypto.com, MrBerry $paystring.crypto.com. It's fucking complicated, but I'm sure that my viewers would be smart enough to work that one out. Today's guest is a 40-year-old New Zealand author and qualified psychologist, Vince McLeod. He is the author of nearly 20 books, including the Clown World Chronicles, which was recently banned from Trade Me. He will be appearing on the show today to discuss the Nordic model and why it is superior to neoliberalism. And welcome to the show, Vince. How are you?
Hello, Stephen. Thanks for having me on. I'm doing very well. It's just very cold here in Nelson today. It's about 6 degrees, so I'm hoping we can warm things up with a good debate.
Right, let's get into it. First of all, the Nordic model. I mean, this has been called all sorts of things across the world. According to Bernie Sanders, it's democratic socialism succeeding. To others, it's just unique, the unique culture in Scandinavia. Some say it's high taxes and high regulation, outdoing capitalism. What the hell is the Nordic model?
The Nordic model is the system of social and economic organization that existed in Scandinavia from about 1970 to about the mid-1990s, wherein they started to become more neoliberal. So the Nordic model, really, what it comes down to is an agreement between the capitalists and the workers to give the workers a better deal than what they got in the Anglo countries. And so there's less social unrest and division.
Okay, and the other thing that we really need to define, I mean, it seems the only people who use the term neoliberal are the ones who don't actually believe in it. Right. And it's certainly a term that I've never used. So what is neoliberalism?
Neoliberalism is otherwise known as Reaganism or Thatcherism, is an alternative system of political and social organization that seeks to shift ownership from the public sphere to the private sphere. And neoliberalism, the point is to cut taxes as low as possible, maximize profits as high as possible in the short term, and not worry so much about long-term consequences, as we're now coming to see in New Zealand and the Western world in general.
Okay, so essentially it's classical liberalism.
It's very similar, but there are some differences. Like, for example, under Adam Smith's style classical liberalism, he considered rent seekers to be parasites. He thought that renting was dead money and that it strangled the economy. But under neoliberalism, rent seeking is not considered to be immoral. So there are still some differences, although they mostly overlap.
All right, so you're telling me that the Nordic model that you're espousing actually doesn't exist in Scandinavia any longer?
Well, it sort of exists in fragments, but it mostly got wiped out by neoliberalism thanks to Anglo and global pressure from other countries. So right, unfortunately, yeah, they've gone down the neoliberal path, unfortunately. But I'd
All right,
argue
so
that's made them worse.
yeah, let's have a look at Sweden. So Sweden was during the 1970s and 80s was highly socialist. Example, tax rates. Astrid Lindgren, who was the writer of Pippi Longstocking, was paying 102% taxes on her highest levels of income. And since the 1980s, Sweden's privatised its rail network. They've abolished electricity, phone monopolies. They abolished death taxes. They privatised most state-owned businesses. For example, Absolute Vodka, which was owned and produced by the government in the 70s up until the 80s. But Sweden's actually wealthier as a result now.
Yeah, well, it's arguable if they are wealthier today than they were in the 1980s. It's certainly true that the society is a lot less pleasant today, thanks to certain neoliberal inventions such as the mass importation of cheap labor from the third world, which is
immigration.
Yeah, in particular, cheap labor. Like Scandinavia, they never really had mass immigration of skilled labor. It was mostly just refugees and so on.
Okay. Now, in terms of like their okay, so they still do have a very generous social welfare state, fully funded public education, health, etc.
That's right. Yeah, that's the basis of the Nordic model, is to take care of people when they're really young by spending a bit of money, and then intend that that'll result in much higher productivity further down the line.
Okay, but they're doing this in a neoliberal manner now, aren't they? For example, Sweden and Finland both have school voucher systems, which fund the students rather than the schools, which would not be out of place in an ACT Party policy manifesto audit.
Yeah, that might not be, but I think the Nordic model, it's not so much about the style of how schools are funded, whether it's by using vouchers or by using central funding, but the degree to which it's funded. Like if you take Finland, for example, you have to have a master's degree to be allowed to work as a teacher in Finland. So they invest, but in return, people with master's degrees who work as teachers get paid a great deal of money because the Finns invest heavily in education. So yeah, I wouldn't quite say that was accurate in the case of the Nordic model.
Okay, so Sweden's essentially doing what it failed to do in the 70s and 80s through privatisation now, isn't it? For example, 823 of their schools are private, 40% of their health providers are private, for profit, 62% of elder care is privately owned for profit. So aren't they essentially using neoliberalism to succeed where their systems in the 70s and 80s failed before?
Well, two things I'd point about that. For one thing, the vast majority of those private schools are religious schools. They're not really so much the sort of charter schools that the ACT Party thought was a good idea. And the second one is I don't believe that just because they've become more neoliberal, that they've necessarily improved things. I would argue that things are actually on the slide since they've shifted to neoliberalism. That the elder care might be a good example of privatization, but I'm not so convinced that education is, because in Sweden they consider the education system to be an investment in the entire younger generation, which pays itself off in the future through higher productivity.
Okay, so all these...
They don't mind paying high taxes for the sake of having really quality teachers, if that leads to quality education and leads to more productivity down the line.
Okay, but then if we, aside from the high taxes and the high levels of social welfare, the economy itself is actually relatively quite free market, just having a look at the Economic Freedom Index from the Heritage Foundation for 2022. So New Zealand was 4th, which has actually been New Zealand's worst result for quite some time. Finland is 9th in the world, Denmark's 10th, Sweden's 11th, Norway's 14th, and the US is 25th for economic freedom. So doesn't that say a lot about why the Scandinavian countries are doing comparatively better and able to afford these higher taxes and social welfare states?
Yeah, I would agree. And I would say that this focuses in on one of the major misconceptions about the Nordic model, which is that it's the same thing as the socialist model that you had in the Soviet Union and China, where you just have high taxes. The Nordic model doesn't just merely have high taxes and high regulations. It only has high taxes, and it allows the free market more or less to regulate itself. And that's why you can see that Sweden is still capable of producing large industrial powerhouses like Spotify is Swedish, Skype is Swedish, the inventor of Minecraft is Swedish. So Sweden's still more than capable of producing great innovations. And this is because that they mostly allow their free market to just go free. But I'd agree with the ACT Party. Yeah, that's free market is a good thing in the sense that Sweden does it, but that's not the Nordic model. The Nordic model is to have high taxes and relatively free markets. That's what's special about it, and that's what makes it different to mere socialism.
Okay, and in terms of protection for workers, etc., I mean, the GDP for workers in most of the Nordic countries is higher than world averages, but the protections for workers are actually virtually nil. There's no minimum wage in Norway, Sweden, or Denmark, and the labour market's extremely flexible in terms of ability to hire and fire. Regulations aren't so much regulations as they are principles which guide negotiation between unions and employers. Again, it seems to me like an example of neoliberalism actually working more effectively than state regulation.
Yeah, well, you could argue that, but the Swedish model has existed ever since, really, you could say it came into existence with what was called the Saltsjöavtalet, which was the big agreement between the workers' unions and the employers' unions in Sweden, where they said, okay, we're not going to have all the fighting that you've seen in other countries where you have all the street violence, the strikes and so on. We're not going to worry about that. So what we're going to do to evade that is just give the workers a fair deal in the first place, which is give them high wages, and then we'll just make money in peace. And that's really the essence of their deal, the Nordic model. If you can contrast that with the Anglo countries, for example, the reason why we have to have a minimum wage is because we have a different employers culture. In Sweden, if you would employ somebody and not pay him enough money that he could actually live on, the other employers, they wouldn't associate with you. They'd consider you just scum, right? But in the Anglo world, if you employ, like we had slavery not long ago, right? We had huge amounts of slavery in the United States. So in the Anglo world, if you employ somebody and don't pay him a wage you can live on, you're considered a good businessman. You're a hard businessman, you drive a hard deal. So we have to have a minimum wage because otherwise we'd be too exploitative, but they don't really have to have one. So, you'd find that there are extremely few people in Scandinavia being employed at wages they can't live on, despite the fact that they don't have a minimum wage.
Well, yes, and that's true. And in fact, income equality is actually fairly good in those countries in the sense that I had the stat written down here. Oh, the bottom. So the bottom 20% of earners are earning about 25% of what the top 20% earn, which is, that's one of the best income equality figures in the world.
Yeah.
But this is despite having a very deregulated labour market, no minimum wage, and unions that just negotiate on behalf of their members, despite not having all these extra protections.
Yeah, well, those protections aren't really necessary unless you already have an exploitative capitalist class like we do have in the Anglo world. But in the Nordic model, you don't have that same aggressive conflict between the classes. You know, you don't have the clashes between the employers and the employees. So they've mostly managed to get around all that thanks to their agreement.
Okay, so I mean, let's have a look at another country in the Nordic model, Norway.
Yep.
So prior to the 1960s, Norway's economy was almost entirely based upon fishing, and it had very low national income. It was on par with Spain at the time, which of course was a fascist state in the 60s.
Yeah.
And it wasn't until in May 1963, the Norwegian government claimed sovereign rights over an exclusive economic zone of the sea. And then in 1969, they discovered oil and are producing 1.6 million barrels a day. Isn't Norway just an example of winning lotto and not being stupid with the winnings?
Yeah, well, I've been to Norway. I've actually spent a few months working there, and they are incredibly rich. They're unbelievably wealthy. Like if you're from New Zealand, it's just about incomprehensible how much wealth actually exists in Norway. But you could take all that oil wealth away, and they'd still be at the level of Denmark and Sweden and Finland that don't have windfall amounts of oil. They'll still be pretty high. And you can sort of tell that from the people because they operate on the same model. Norway still operates on the Nordic model in the sense that their money is reinvested in the younger generations. That's why Norway is different to the oil kleptocracies of, say, the Middle East, where the ruling class just steals the money and spends it on gold-plated Mercedes and things like this. That's not neoliberalism, of course, but you know. But the Nordic model is to take that money and reinvest it rather than just pissing it up the wall.
Well, yeah, that's right. I mean, since the 1970s, the GDP's gone up 500%. The oil company Statoil, which is still owned by the state, invests all that money into a sovereign wealth fund. But I mean, of course, it's also a fluke because they discovered oil, whereas prior to the oil discovery, Norway was not particularly rich. But the other flip side is, I guess it's the inflationary effect of having too much cash chasing too few goods. The cost of living, you would have noticed during your time in Norway, is much higher than, say, the United States. For example, the cost of utility bills versus the US. The US is about 130 a month. Norway it's 176 a month. The cost of a Volkswagen Golf in Norway is $36,500 versus $20,000 in the US.
That mostly tax that difference.
Yeah,
they tax new cars very highly in Norway.
Yeah. So, in a sense, it's while Norway is still very wealthy, it's also much more expensive to live there.
That's certainly true. It's not a great place for tourists, I'll admit. But one point that I'd like to make is that if New Zealand, for example, had struck oil the same way that Norway had done in the 1990s, say under Bolger and Longy and Shipley and all these neoliberals, they just would have sold all the rights off to international banking and finance interests, and New Zealanders would have been left with very little. Now that's totally different to how Norway did it. Norway took that money and invested it into their own people, and so that's the major reason why they're so wealthy today. It's because they have very low levels of mental illness that relate from, for example, financial stress, and they have excellent levels of education. So they're extremely productive. They're both low levels of mental poor health, and they have high levels of education. So that's the main reason why they're so wealthy. I mean, they could have taken that oil money and just wasted it like the Arabs did and the Africans did, but they didn't. They're clever.
So generally, high taxes and high social spending around the rest of the world has failed. The United Kingdom went on a mass nationalisation spree after World War II, and it didn't rationing didn't end until the early 1950s as a result. And the United Kingdom was incredibly poor by the 1970s as a result of it owning basically airlines, oil companies, travel agencies. The most bizarre things were all owned and run by the state, and they weren't run for profit, which is why Thatcherism was so revolutionary. But what makes the Nordic countries different in the sense that they can tolerate these higher taxes and higher social security systems without going into the decline which we saw in much of the rest of the Western world around that time?
The major reason, in my opinion, is that the Scandinavian countries are a lot more homogenous than the, let's say, America and Britain and New Zealand, Australia, for example, the Anglo countries. And so that means that if you pay taxes to the government and the government spends that money on poor people, not on you, but on people poorer than you, then that money is still benefiting someone kind of like you, because the poor, there's not that much difference between the poor and the middle class and the wealthy in Scandinavia. But in America and Britain, if you pay taxes to the government and the government spends that money on poor people, they're probably spending it on blacks or Muslims or working class people who are very different to you. And so people don't feel the same degree of solidarity that they do in the Scandinavian countries. Now, this is proven. If you look at the economic psychology literature, there's an example of what's called dictator studies, where a person they perform a task in cooperation with another person, and then they're asked how much of a reward they'd like to share with that other person. And what they've found is that people share a lot more when there's a higher degree of kinship intensity with the recipient of the sharing. So basically, people don't mind paying taxes if the recipient of the taxes are like them in major ways, which they are in the Scandinavian countries, thanks to the high levels of homogeneity.
So it is a racial and cultural issue that makes this results in this Nordic exceptionalism.
Yeah, it is to a major extent, and it's one reason why they've become the Nordic model is kind of disappearing now that they've had mass waves of third world immigration. People don't want to pay taxes anymore because they're going to basically Africans and Muslims. But this was known by the Swedish government in the 1990s when they opened the borders. They knew that would be the result. But it's neoliberalism for you, you know. Free movement across borders, even if it's cheap labor.
Yeah, well, I guess it was the European Union as well, wasn't it?
Yeah, the EU would have forced a bit on them as well. But I'd argue that the European Union is not, they don't follow the Nordic model. They're just globalist whores.
Yeah, no, absolutely. All right, so if we have a look at Denmark, now Denmark's a same model, but in terms of wealth, they're not in the same position as Norway because they don't have oil reserves. After taxes, sorry?
Like, no, it is. Switzerland is the only real country that's even in the same league as Norway when it comes to wealth, unless you count places like Liechtenstein and Luxembourg and these little places. Like, Norway's wealthier than anywhere on planet Earth, apart from just a few little exceptions. So Denmark, yeah, I mean, Denmark's still doing pretty good, yeah.
Though their after-tax disposable income is 27% lower than the USA, according to the Centre of Political Studies in Denmark.
Yeah,
and the price of consumer goods is higher as well. For example, an iPhone that you might get for about $650 in the US would be over $1,000 in Denmark. So higher price of consumer goods, despite the fact that there's social goods which are free.
Free. Well, the GST in Scandinavia is about 25%. At least it is in Sweden. I think it's probably similar in Denmark as well. So they have a lot of high taxes on consumer goods, luxury goods like oil and alcohol and and brand new electronics and brand new cars have a lot of taxes on them. But one thing I'd point out is that if you look at the total GDP, the total amount of a nation's GDP that's spent by the government, in Sweden it's about 53%, which is pretty high. But that's not as high as France and Belgium, for example, and they don't operate under the Nordic model. They have high taxes and then just waste that money. And it's not much higher than the United States, which is at about 46, because they take in a lot of money to spend on their military and so on. So Sweden,
so the US does have it does run in deficits of about 14 to 18% of GDP as well.
Oh yeah, yeah, that's part of it. Like in Scandinavia, they don't. Like if you look at the amount of debt as a percentage of GDP, in Scandinavia it's fairly low. Like in Sweden, it's around 40%. Denmark and Norway, it's about 30%. So it's still very low. Like they don't, they're not into the idea of taking up big debts and having their grandchildren pay them back, like we Anglos are, and which is really what neoliberalism has done to a major extent.
Though the privatisation of the pension systems will have had a lot to do with that as well, wouldn't it? Most of those countries, Denmark doesn't, but the other countries, as part of their taxation, require you to put contribute a certain amount to your retirement, and
Yeah,
that's run by private companies. Kind of neoliberal, I would have thought.
Well, arguable. I mean, it depends. I mean, if it wasn't run by private companies, it probably still would exist, but just be run by the government. Like I don't mind. Well, yeah, possibly.
It wouldn't be anywhere near as good, though, would it?
Well, it could be. I mean, they're taking in the same amount of money either way, because it's the private companies in Scandinavia. They still are funded by the government mostly. They're not funded by private payments, are they? I'm not sure about that, actually. I was too young to worry about a pension when I was there, you see.
And now we're both old enough to worry about it. But I mean, yeah. You're right. I mean, the money is taken compulsorily from the individual and then funneled to the private pension investor. So yeah. I guess you could call it in that sense government funded, but it's still run by the private sector.
Yeah, well, I mean, I don't think there's much of a difference between neoliberalism and the Nordic model when it comes to specific things like that. I mean, I think neoliberalism. I'm not actually sure what neoliberalism thinks when it comes to pensions, because on the one hand, I would think they would want to just let the pensioners die because it's cheaper, but on the other hand, they're old, so national act like old people. So I'm not sure what the deal is there actually.
Oh, well, I mean, my view was that you would save for your own retirement.
Right. Okay. Yeah. And if you didn't.
And if you didn't.
Yeah, if you didn't. I mean, let's say you had an illness for many years and you were unable to save.
That would depend on. I guess that would be a cultural thing too, and it's why you can't. It's why there would never be a libertarian revolution, because it just wouldn't stick unless, as opposed to if it were voted in by a majority, because you wouldn't have the cultural standards to survive, I suppose. If you foisted it on very quickly, there would be no private charity set up to look after people who had been unable to save for their retirement or have become ill. So ultimately, yeah, I would eventually abolish all that state support, but you would have to have the right culture in place for that to be successful, which I guess is partly why the Nordic high taxes and high social welfare state hasn't destroyed their countries as it has in most of the rest of the world.
Yeah, well, it comes back to the solidarity and the kinship intensity. Like in Scandinavia, there are a lot of people who become welfare parasites, but they are much less inclined to do that than they are in the Anglo countries. Like, for example, a lot of people that I know, they're thinking, what's the point in me working when all that money is just going to be taken off me and given to browns and blacks? You know, the future is brown. So why should I be motivated to contribute to it as a white person? But it's different in Scandinavia because the future is, to a larger extent, they're still going to be their own people in the future. Like, I don't know even who's going to be in New Zealand in 50 years' time. Could be 15 million people and 10 million of them are Chinese and African, for all I know. That could be possible. So why bother to contribute and really, you know, stress myself to make contribution to the future? But in Sweden, they can see that the money's going to their own people, you know.
That's an interesting point. I mean, as a libertarian, I would open up the borders for people to come if they wish, but that would be on the condition that there's no social welfare state, so that only people who are productive or intending to be productive would want to come to the country in any case. Though I really don't care what their skin color is. I just want to be left alone to get on with my life instead of having the state interfere to require me to support other people as well.
Yeah, well, I think that's a noble sentiment. Like, I'm not even going to argue against that. I think that's a good thing. But yeah, I think there's always going to be an element of society that's going to be at the bottom end of the bell curve in terms of intelligence and in terms of natural ability to make it. So the question really is how they're dealt with. Like, the Nordic model decides to put a lot of money into these people and make them productive in the long term to the best extent that's possible. And I'd argue that neoliberalism, like if you look at euthanasia, what it did to New Zealand in the early 1990s, you're just seeing the consequences of that in terms of all these ram raids and gang members and other shootings and other psychos. You've got people who are damaged by poverty that don't exist in the Nordic model to such an extent.
Though today in New Zealand, social welfare spending has never been higher. Health spending is at record heights per head of population, as it has been every single year since 2009. Education spending is the same, higher per head of population since 2009. The government has never ever spent as much money as it does today, and yet our economic figures are just declining. And interestingly, unemployment now down at historic lows that we haven't seen in decades, while inflation's up to 7.9%. Very, very similar to the figures of the 70s and 80s. And through much of the 70s, unemployment stayed well under 2%, but inflation would get as high as 18%. And you might, I mean, what's the point of everybody being employed if your wages lose 1/5 of their value every year?
Yeah, that's true. That's true. But I'd point out also that the fact that unemployment in New Zealand is 3.2%, that puts the lie to the neoliberal claim that raising the minimum wage will increase unemployment, because the minimum wage has gone up dozens of times since the 1980s, 1990s, but the unemployment rate's still 3.2%.
Yep, you're right. The minimum wage has gone up 35% since 2017. And however, the number of people on the job seekers benefit is well up, despite the low unemployment. There's an extra 10,000 people working for the public sector, and jobs which I imagine aren't needed. And there's also the economic concept of opportunity cost. So unemployment's 3.2% now with a minimum wage of $21.20. But what's the unseen cost? What would that money be spent on otherwise that may be more productive were it not for that minimum wage? So while employment looks low at 3.2%, could it have been 2.8%? Were wages more aligned to what the market's willing to pay? And that's not visible.
No, I don't think it is, but I don't think that's really a criticism of the Nordic model, because the Nordic model has always had low unemployment because they believe that that was necessary to get the maximum productivity out of the population in general. So, yeah, well, I mean, Scandinavia, they didn't really have that high inflation at any point, I don't think. Maybe it was in the 10s, 12s or so, but they seem to be going pretty good as far as I know.
Yeah, I have to admit I didn't look up their inflation figures at that time.
No.
What I did note though was that they essentially followed a similar pattern of reforms to what the rest of the world did in the 70s and 80s. If the example of Sweden, where the wealthiest were paying 102% tax on their income, and they themselves went through the same sort of reforms that much of the rest of the Western world went through too, in terms of reducing government spending, privatizing government assets, and deregulating their economy. So,
Yep. They have, and the vast majority of Swedes would say that life's got worse since they did all that. I mean, there's a lot more crime.
But they rate in the top of the world on well-being and happiness indexes now.
Yep, and they would have been even higher.
Are you telling me that
they were? I mean, I would tell
there's
you
an
that
opportunity cost to happiness?
No, I'll tell you that the standard of living that existed in Scandinavia 25 years ago was probably the highest that's ever existed in world history anywhere. And just because they've become a bit more neoliberal and they're still high in the rankings doesn't mean that they wouldn't be even higher if they'd maintained making heavy investments in the next generation.
Whereas I would argue that they had to reform because it was just no longer affordable. You get to the stage where you can't actually raise taxes anymore because it kills the economy and reduces income, reduces revenue from those taxes. And surely that was the state that they'd got themselves into in the 80s when they decided to go through the free market reforms, as much as the rest of the Western world had done as well. And the result of those reforms, if we look at, say, global poverty, which in the 1980s, at the height of communism, 40% of the population lived on less than, the measure now is $2.20 US a day, thanks to inflation since the 1980s. But now it's 8% of the world lives in that level of poverty. After the fall of communism, after the rise of neoliberalism, after becoming more capitalist and free market and globalist than any time in human history.
Yeah, well, I'm not sure if you want to really claim that as a win for neoliberalism, because the vast majority of the people who have moved out of poverty into a quality standard of living over the last 40 years have been Chinese. Most of them are Chinese, and I don't think you can really count the Chinese government as neoliberal.
I think economically you could, to a degree.
Okay.
I mean, would we call China a communist economy still? I don't think so. All their economic growth has come since they also went through a similar free market reform pattern in the late 80s and early 90s.
Yeah, well, I'll just about call them nationalist socialists, really. But I don't know if I don't consider China to be an example of the Nordic model in any case, because they don't make heavy tax investments in the education and healthcare of the following generations. They just they're a pretty low tax sort of system. I think the interesting thing will be is to see if they transition from what they are now, which is like, I think neoliberalism is pretty decent if you're moving from an extremely poor country to a mid-wealth country. But if you want to move from a mid-wealth country to a high-wealth country, then you need to make heavy investments in people. And I would like to see if China does that over the next 20 years. I think it'd be real interesting.
So with the changes to these Nordic economies until now, what would you undo?
I would undo
you're telling me that these don't operate on the Nordic model anymore. So what reforms would you think would be appropriate to take them from the position they are in now back to the Nordic model?
First thing I would do would be to stop the mass immigration of cheap labor, because increasing the supply of labor, as you will appreciate, decreases the price of labor. And that's something which the Nordic model was supposed to be against. It was supposed to be about maintaining the standard of living of the average worker by protecting their wages against cheap labor from overseas. So that's the first thing I'd change. I wouldn't change taxes. I wouldn't increase taxes anywhere, because I know this is a misconception that the Nordic model is just based around high taxes. I think they've intelligently applied their taxes because they don't have so much in the way of income taxes. They're not actually that high. Like I said, a lot of taxes are on petrol and on luxuries like alcohol and cigarettes and so on. So I wouldn't change that.
The personal tax rates in Sweden's up to 57%, Denmark up to 56%, Finland up to 53%, Norway's comparatively low at 38%. However, those are split between municipal and national taxes. For example, Denmark, about half of their income tax is local level tax, and the other half is national level tax.
Yeah, that's true. Like, I mean, so one thing I probably also would change in the case of Sweden is to continue with their support for small businesses, because they actually have quite a lot of government support for people who want to start their own companies. Unlike the Anglo world, where it's mostly you can get something started if you've got a lot of capital, but if you don't, the government's not going to help you. But in Sweden, there's a lot of grants for people who start their own companies. And that's why you've got places like, you've got businesses like Skype and Spotify and Minecraft starting up in Sweden, because these places get properly funded from the beginning. So yeah, I'd keep doing that.
That's corporate welfare, though, isn't it? Privatise the profits and socialise the losses?
I don't know if it's corporate welfare, if it's going to individuals who have just started their own companies. I think corporate welfare is more when you pay out South Canterbury Finance $1 billion. Which is what happened under the national government here in New Zealand.
Which had to happen so that the shareholders wouldn't lose money.
Yeah.
But personally, I think if there's no risk of shareholders losing money, then what's the point of providing interest or on a dividend?
Yeah.
Well, I mean,
yeah. Well, I mean, I would say that the government shouldn't be subordinated to the needs of capital in cases like that, and it usually isn't under the Nordic model. Like the Nordic model, the point is to make the population happy and healthy. It's not so much to generate profit. Yeah. Yeah. What else would I change?
All right. What about the mass privatizations that took place since the 80s? Would you reverse those?
Yeah, well, I would, because one of the reasons why Scandinavia didn't used to need such a high tax rate is because they still owned their own assets, and they still generated their own profits from those assets. As an example from Norway that you gave earlier with their oil company. So because they got those revenues coming in from the assets they still owned, they didn't need to charge quite as high taxes. So I think the Nordic model was probably more effective by if it keeps those big assets under state control, like the Norwegians have with their oil, and selling things off. I think that's more of a neoliberal thing, because then you have to start paying taxes to fund everything instead of just using revenues from state-owned assets.
So Sweden should have maintained ownership of its vodka company, the Swedish government, they should have maintained ownership of the railways and the telecommunications and electricity.
Yeah, certainly the monopolies, like the railways and the electricity.
Because the result from privatising those in New Zealand was quite positive. I mean, we couldn't in the 80s. You would take up to 6 weeks just to get a phone line, and prior to that, people shared party lines in which if you rang one person out of a party of 6, everybody's telephone would ring, but the sound of the ring would tell you whether it was for your house or for your neighbours. Really,
yeah, well, I remember my
really
grandmother telling me about
shit like that. Railways were losing $1 million a day. They were losing people's equipment on the rails. I can't imagine that.
I'm not arguing for Mulhoonism.
No. Okay. All right.
Now, I want to keep things the Nordic model. Oh, and a question I have, like, if privatization is so good, then how come we're so much poorer in New Zealand than in Scandinavia?
Well, we're poorer than Norway because we don't have oil assets.
Right.
But are we actually poorer, or are we just less?
If you look up the GDP per capita of New Zealand, it's about $43,000.
Yeah.
Whereas Sweden's in the 50s, they're like 53, 54,000, and Denmark's even higher still at about 60,000.
That is true.
So it seems like their investments in the next generation have paid massive dividends when it comes to high productivity 20 years down the line, as opposed to our euthanasia model.
Is it because they became wealthy countries before they became social welfare states?
No,
For example,
social welfare states.
1946 in Finland, they didn't nationalise all their means of production like what happened in the UK. So, and they also didn't have a massive welfare state like they do now. So, is it because they became wealthy first through neoliberal methods and free market methods before they started widely expanding the welfare state in the 70s and 80s?
Well, I don't believe that the welfare state was widely expanded in Scandinavia in the 70s and 80s, because already in the 1960s you had the concept of the folkhemmet, which is basically a home for the people. The idea that the nation was supposed to be a home, the country was supposed to be a home for the nation, rather than being a operating base for international banking and finance interests like New Zealand is. So I'd argue that it was rather that they took care of their people, and those people grew up to want to contribute to wider society, in opposition to New Zealanders who don't really care because they're not taken care of. So, you know, I'd argue that they've just got what they paid for, and so did we.
I've got a question from Julian Crawford. What are your thoughts on the girl with dragon tattoo author who claimed there was too much white nationalism and skinheads in Sweden?
Well, that all came out after I left Scandinavia for the first time. But I would point out that the existence of all these successful Swedish authors, because the girl with the dragon tattoo, I think that's Stieg Larsson, that's only one person, but there are several others, is just more proof that Scandinavia is capable of making the creative and innovative breakthroughs that people say that you need to have low taxes for.
Now, I mean, it does illustrate. I mean, yeah, what one author's claim is pretty largely irrelevant. I mean, look at was it Taika Waititi?
Oh yeah,
I'm already going to be labelled racist now because I can't pronounce his name, but he called New Zealand racist as fuck. It's one person's opinion. But there is certainly a trend in the Nordic states now towards increased popularity of far-right political parties. And that would probably be linked to a fear of foreigners based on their concern that foreigners will come in and exploit the social welfare system without contributing.
Yeah, well, it's more than that. I mean, I think it's mostly the violence and the rapes they're upset about, but the exploitation of the welfare system is definitely up there, probably top 5 concern.
Yeah, well, Sweden especially it's reported much higher violent and sexual offences in the last decade since the mass migrations from Africa and the Middle East.
Yeah, and that's why neoliberalism doesn't work, because it brings in people who don't have anything in common with the existing population, and so they've got less to lose by exploiting them.
But have they been attracted there because of the large welfare state rather than neoliberalism? They're not all lining up to go to countries with no social welfare systems, are they? I mean, they're leaving countries that have no social welfare systems.
I disagree. These
So
people
it's
are
not
pulling
really an
into
issue with neoliberalism, isn't it? Is it? It's a problem with socialism. It brings in people who whose intent is to act as parasites.
Well, I'd argue that's not a failing of socialism, that's a failing of globalism, because you don't have to let these people in for cheap labor. You know, you can just enforce your borders and not let them in. That's always a possibility.
You could say the same for tariffs on goods, though, couldn't you? By allowing goods from other countries into your country without putting a tax on it, that lowers the price that goods produced in your country can attract, and makes it more difficult for producers to compete.
Yep.
But at the same time, we've realised, well, maybe if they can't compete against cheaper imports, maybe it's not actually worth them producing those goods, and instead to produce goods which are competitive against other imports.
Yep,
Couldn't the same argument be made against? Couldn't the same argument be made against labour as well?
Well, it could be if it wasn't for the fact that the importation of cheap labor literally replaces the existing nation. But I don't think this is so much a, well, it possibly is a question about really who the immigration laws are there to benefit. If it's there to benefit the people, like it is under the Nordic model, or if it's there to benefit the corporates, like they are under the neoliberal model.
No, if we apply this attitude to New Zealand, which is crying out for nurses, teachers, etc., and people aren't moving here because it's just too damn bloody hard, and there's no guarantee of residency. Would you say that closing your borders up to migration is working for New Zealand?
Well, firstly, I have to point out that we should be honest here and say that the reason why it's hard to attract staff is because wages are so low. That's the number one reason, because those same workers who can come here from the Philippines, they can go to Australia and get 80% higher wages. If we would pay the same wages in New Zealand as they pay in Aussie, we wouldn't have those problems. So I'd say that really it's the low wage mentality of neoliberalism that's caused this problem.
Well, but surely the unwillingness of the government to guarantee residency for people coming to fill in these skill gap areas is also responsible for those shortages.
I've got no problem with skilled labour coming here. It's just the unskilled labour that comes in and doesn't make a net positive contribution. That's what I have the problem with. And that's what I'll admit that under the original Nordic model, they kept both of those people out. And that was probably a mistake. They probably should have been more open to the highly educated global part of the workforce than what they were. So I suppose you can tick that up as one point for neoliberalism there.
Well, I mean, the thing about wealthier countries is that the people who are born in those countries and grow up in them don't tend to want to do the low-skilled work. And if you don't allow unskilled workers into the country, then you simply can't fill the jobs, or you have to pay a wage that's so high that it makes the jobs uneconomical.
Well, if the job's uneconomical, that's the free market telling you that it doesn't need to be done.
Or it's artificial restrictions making it uneconomical. For example, a oppressively high minimum wage.
If I want to buy a Ferrari, because a Ferrari costs 200 grand, but I don't have that much money because I'm too poor, it doesn't mean there's a Ferrari shortage. It means that I need to get into my head that it's time to pay a higher price. And I would argue that if the employer class under neoliberalism thinks that it can just import cheap labor instead of investing in the population, then that's a ticket to going down the toilet. 20 years down the path, we won't have invested anything in capital. We won't have invested anything in education. We'll just have hordes of cheap labor with IQs of 85, and our productivity will go down the toilet.
Well, productivity is already down the toilet in New Zealand.
Yeah, but imagine if you went back to the 1950s and didn't import all the cheap labour into New Zealand, right? That productivity, I would argue that it would be considerably higher, and that our standard of living would consequently be considerably higher. And that's one thing that we could take from the Nordic model, is trying to maintain those high levels of kinship intensity through low levels of mass cheap labour importation.
Yeah, I mean, there's no doubt that there seems to be a culture of collectivism in the Nordic countries, but it's not one that's the result of government repression or regulation, but it's an organic culture, which I mean, I'm an individualist, but of course, individuals enter into collectives all the time willingly. I mean, I work for an employer, that's me willingly entering into a collective. But there does seem to be a different sort of collective culture in these countries, which means that they're doing fine with the large welfare states, whereas just about every other area in the world, it does not work.
It's because of the high.
What about small population size too? Sorry, that was the other thing I wanted to ask. Each of these countries, about 5-6 million people.
Sweden's about 10, but the others are about 5 or 6. Yeah.
Yeah. So would that be the reason? Would that also contribute to the fact that these systems are less unsuccessful than in a country like the United States?
I would argue no, because if you look at the case of Japan, for example, they also have a high population like the United States. It's not as big as the United States, but it's still a lot bigger than Scandinavia. And they also have a high level of kinship intensity because of low levels of mass immigration. And you see that in Japan, that's led to low levels of crime, high levels of social cohesion. And so I don't think it's simply a Scandinavian thing. I think that that's just natural. It's something that naturally follows from high levels of kinship intensity.
So it sounds like opening up our borders to trade is a positive, but closing our borders to people who look different from us, people from different races, is that the way to make these sorts of is closing off your borders to different races the solution to economic prosperity?
Well, closing your borders off to low IQ people certainly is. Like, I would not argue that we should close our borders off to high IQ people from China and Korea and Japan and Hong Kong, Singapore, Taiwan. I would not argue for that. I would not argue that we keep our borders closed to high IQ Brahmin caste Indians either. But as far as low IQ people from low IQ groups of people are concerned, yeah, I'd say keep them out. And I'd say that's something the Nordic model has done so well. They've looked after their own people until they became neoliberal. And I think if you'd ask Swedes whether or not they benefited from the mass importation of third world cheap labour, they'd definitely say no, that they haven't.
All right. Vince, people are going to be asking themselves watching this, are you just a racist old white man?
Yes, I am, but I'll point out that all of my friends from other races are also racist. I don't care what race you are, as long as you're a racist.
All right, we've got 1 minute left. Is there anything I haven't covered off?
I don't think so. But if I can say one thing, I would like to say: just watch the next 20 years of economic development. I think you'll see that the Scandinavians will do a lot better than America will do, because they've invested a lot more in their next generation. That's my prediction. So we'll see if it comes true or not.
Okay, great. All right. Well, thank you very much for appearing on the show, Vince. And
cheers, Stephen. It was a pleasure to talk to you. I hope we entertained
likewise, and I appreciate the challenge. This has been a very good debate. So thank you very much, Vince, and cheers, thank you for participating in the Inquisition.
No worries. I look forward to coming to talk to you about God the next time.
So do I.